Welcome back, everybody. In today's video, we're going to do stage one of my Gambler 500 Mitsubishi Mighty Max build. So if you guys are new to this truck, this is my 1988 Dodge Ram 50 that I've turned into a Mighty Max. Now, they're basically the same truck, and I picked this up after the Gambler 500 this year. And if you're wondering what that's about, go check out my video on the Montana Gambler 500. I go over why I picked up this car, some of the plans with it. It's going to be a great build. So today I'm starting stage one. I'm doing one of three. It's going to take me a while to do the other two stages. And so in the meantime, I want to do some modifications to make this really fun, something I can drive all the time, something I can beat up. And I've given myself a deadline because the next Gambler event is in 2 weeks. So I have 2 weeks to get this thing ready, to do all the maintenance items and to modify it. You can see I've got some tires in the back. I've got some lights on it already, but let's get this thing drug into the shop and I'll show you exactly what I'm thinking for stage one. So let's talk about stage one of this Mighty Max build. Again, this car is meant to be a beater. As you can tell, the body is thrashed. It's been through a lot. It's kind of like barely hanging on. There's not a straight panel on this thing. The paint's all messed up from being in the Gambler, and I'm okay with that because I just want to have fun with this. I want to do as much as I can for as cheap as possible and just have a good time. So I talked about in the last episode on this truck that I was going to swap a 4.3 Vortec into it, put an NV3500 transmission on it, do maybe a solid axle swap, and that's still the plan, but that is now stage two. And the reason is I'm having a little trouble with the transmission. Turns out the Dodge transmission that I wanted didn't work out. And so I'm on the hunt for another transmission. And in the meantime, rather than just sit around and not do anything, I'm itching to do something with this truck. And so we're going to do a stage one build. Later on, I'll get into the major plans for this, but let's talk about what I'm going to do to this on the cheap to have as much fun as possible. So here's the list. I've written it on the fender and then I'm just going to cross things off as I go. One of the advantages of having a white and don't care about fender. So I've got a handful of things that I've got to tackle. These are kind of in order, and these are mostly optional, and these are mostly kind of mandatory. So the first one is it's got a massive engine leak. It's leaking a ton of oil, and most of the time I'd be like, yeah, oil leak, no problem. But it's just leaving a massive puddle everywhere I go. It's ruining my friends' driveways, and honestly, it's just annoying. So I figure while I'm taking the time to work on it, I might as well pinpoint where that's at. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually pull this out, power wash it, put some leak dye detector in it, and figure it out. But I've got to figure out that engine leak depending on how bad it is. I might actually pull the motor out to fix that, but I'm not looking to spend a bunch of money. Just seal it up with some RTV or whatever it takes and put it back in. The next thing is going to be transmission. And the big reason the transmission is coming out is because the clutch is like this close to being fried. It's really chattery. Any day now it's just going to let go. And so as much fun as it is to just rally this thing, not having a clutch is no fun. So I did order a new clutch. It's in there. And I figured while I've got the transmission out, I might as well put that one in. It's a transmission that I pulled out of a different truck about a year ago, and I've had it sitting on the shelf. It's in way better shape because the one in here actually doesn't have second gear. So I figure if I'm going to pull the transmission anyways, might as well put a better one in. So that one's only got 100,000 miles on it. It was free to me. The car I parted out, I made money on, and so that was free to me, so I'll throw that in. The other thing I want to do is I want to replace the shocks because, again, it's super cheap, and these ones are roasted. And then I want to get a little creative, and this is mostly just for the fun of it. Right now, it's running the stock Mighty Max diffs, and they're 3.9 front and rear, which is not a great gear ratio. But I have the diffs out of a different Montero that are 4.6s, and they're bigger. So I'll get into that in a bit. I'm going to do an axle swap. I'm going to do a differential swap on the front of this. It's going to require a little bit of work. But when I switch those diffs out, not only will I have stronger diffs, better gear ratio, I'll actually be able to run 33s at the same gear ratio as I have now. So hopefully I'll be able to turn those 33-inch tires. I got to figure out how to fit those. So I'm either going to do, well, I'm definitely going to do a torsion bar lift. And then I might have to do a body lift too to clear those. A lot of cutting and clearing, whatever. I want to run 33s on this. I want to do the diff swap. I want to show you guys how easy it is to mix and match parts from the Raiders, the Monteros, the Mighty Maxes, all that stuff. So I want to show you all that. So that's all the stuff that I'm really hoping to get done. And then I've got fun Gambler stuff like the light whips, emergency light, the PA system. I have a pretty sick stereo system that I'm pulling out of a different car to go in here. And I want to teach myself how to tint windows. This car doesn't have AC. It's super hot. I bought some window tint for cheap, and so I'm going to hopefully learn how to throw that on and tint those windows. So there's the list. I'm going to take you guys through the entire process. We're going to do all of this, hopefully, fingers crossed, in the next 2 weeks. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to back this car out. I'm going to power wash it, put some leak dye detector in it, and see if we can't find that engine leak. All right, before we go any further, let me explain a little bit of what I'm doing with swapping all of these parts. There are a ton of Monteros, and honestly, as I'm going back through editing this video, I'm realizing I mix and match some names, and I'm so sorry for the confusion. I think realistically, I have 3 cars that I'm putting into this one. So the car I'm sitting in right now, the truck we're working on, is a Dodge Ram 50. Whether you call it a Ram 50, a Dodge 50, a D50, there's all sorts of different names to it. It is the Dodge version of a Mitsubishi Mighty Max. Now, when I'm done with this truck, I'm going to call it the Mighty Max. That's what I like. It's going to be mostly Mighty Max at the end of it. But right now, the title says Ram 50. That's what this is. So this is a 1988 Ram 50. I have another Mighty Max. That's a 1991 Mitsubishi Mighty Max. That came with the V6, a manual transmission. It's got the bigger diffs. It's got a different gear ratio. I'm going to be pulling the rear axle out of that one. And then I've got a Raider that I scrapped, and I think it was an 87. I'm not 100% sure. It had the same motor as the Ram 50 that I'm in right now, but it had a different transmission. That's the transmission I'm going to swap in. That's the one with the hydraulic clutch. In addition to that Raider, I had another Raider. I think it was either an 89, a 90, or maybe a 91. That Raider was a V6 with a manual transmission, and I am pulling the rear third member for the differential out of that one, and the front diff and the CV axles. So hopefully that makes some sense of it. As I go through the video, I'm kind of all over the place. I'm filming most of this at 2 a.m. when I'm trying to swap it together, and some of the names and some of the dates are not straight. So hopefully that's helpful, but that's what I'm doing. All right, now that we got that cleared out of the way, let's get back to power washing this thing. Now, normally an oil leak like this would not bother me, especially when it's such a cheap car. However, the thing that was really driving me nuts is I couldn't figure out where this was coming from, and it was leaking all over my friends' driveways, and so I just wanted to figure it out while I was in there. So now that I have this all cleaned off, this oil leak is so bad, it just throws oil everywhere. And I mean, it leaks everywhere I go. You can see a couple drips there, but usually it's this huge pool of oil everywhere I park. So I got to figure out where this is. I've cleaned it all off, and I'm going to run some leak detector dye in it because I cannot figure out where it's coming from. There's just so much of it, it just goes everywhere. So I'm going to put a little bit of this in and then run the motor for a little bit. I'll shine a UV light in there, and hopefully I can see just a couple drips instead of just the splatter that it's been. Then I can go in there and just fix it up, get it patched up. I also noticed that while I was in here, this is gonna be a little hard to see. This is looking real sketchy. See that right there? That's a bad time. So I don't entirely sure what's going on there. The starter wire is hot and it's bridging up against the starter, so I gotta fix that. So I'm gonna disconnect the battery. It turns out this thing could have caught on fire. So I'm gonna get that fixed because I don't want to gamble that hard. Also, you can see up there, one of the bell housing bolts is already loose. I think all of these were a little bit loose when I bought it. I tightened some of them up, but yeah, half the work's already done for me. As you can tell listening to this motor, it is sad. There's a lot of pressure coming out of the oil fill cap. This motor is not long for this world. Well, ironically, after putting in the leak detecting dye and looking at this thing with a light, I actually cannot find the leak. So it's super frustrating. I'm not 100% sure what's going on. It's looking relatively clean. It looks like there's a little plate down there that might be leaking, as well as I think the fuel pump. So I'm 50-50. Maybe this motor comes out, maybe it doesn't. Honestly, the only reason I wouldn't want to pull it out is these stupid vacuum lines. There's just so many of them, and I don't want to spend the money on a Weber carb conversion. So I'm going to leave that for later because I know that no matter what, I need to pull the transmission out to get to the clutch. So the next step is to get this thing up in the air and start ripping out the old transmission so I can put that one in with a fresh clutch. Guys, check this out. I was wondering why I had so much slop in my steering. And I think I figured it out. There's no bushing left on that. That's actually kind of amazing that this was driving as well as it was. So I have to pull that from the other car. If it's in better shape, or just get a new one. That is so good. After figuring out why my steering was so sloppy, I moved inside and removed the shift levers. So the first step in taking out the shifters is to remove the boot and the metal cover. And now that I'm in here, I can see there's 4 bolts right here for the transmission shifter and 3 for the transfer case shifter. So I'm gonna get that pulled out, and then I'll have both of these levers out, and everything else will be underneath the car. All right, got that one out of the way. This one seems to be a little stuck. Looks like maybe it's got some RTV on it or something. Yeah, just had to pry it out. There, that one's out. All right, so there's the top of the transmission. The rest of it is underneath the car. Underneath the car, the process was pretty simple. I removed all of the attachments, the drive lines, everything else, and I dropped the transmission and drug it out. So after some struggle, I've got both the transmissions out. This is the one that came out of a Dodge Raider that I parted out, like I said, a couple of years ago. And this is the one that just came out of the Dodge Ram 50. So they are exactly the same as far as I can tell. At least the exterior looks exactly the same, with one exception. All of the 4-cylinder Mighty Maxes had a cable-driven clutch. So the throwout bearing is actuated by a cable that's put up right here, and it pulls against there, and that's what actuates the throwout bearing, and you can see the whole mechanism there. And this bell housing is actually completely different than that bell housing, even though they have all the same mounting holes, the same size. Because of the way that this throwout bearing is actuated, it's completely different. And I knew that going into it because I knew that this one was hydraulic, and I actually have a solution for this. So the other Mighty Max that I have has a hydraulic clutch in it, and I can steal the hydraulic clutch off of another car and I can drop it into here. So I can actually convert this car, this Mighty Max that I'm working on right now, to run a hydraulic clutch, and therefore it can work with all of the clutch fork assembly that goes in here, all of that. So that's not a big deal. If I was trying to do this and I didn't know that, or I didn't have the parts, this swap would not work. But because I have a parts card, because I have all the parts from that one, I can actually swap them over. So that's really nice. This thing is so gnarly. It's so dirty. Honestly, this one was really dirty too before I power washed it, but I'm really glad I have this hunk of junk out. The other thing that was obvious when I was getting in here is all of these bell housing bolts were either finger tight or missing. So that's probably why I had so much clutch shudder, is I bet the clutch just wasn't even seated correctly against this. I bet there was enough movement that it just wasn't getting a good engagement. And so I don't know how that's affected the clutch. Maybe I don't need a new one, but either way, I'm in here. I might as well do it. And I'm going to make sure that when I put that one in, I actually have all of the bell housing bolts. So after getting the transmission out, it is no wonder that this clutch was slipping and grabbing and stuttering. You can see it's pretty messed up here. The flywheel actually looks okay. It could probably use a resurface, but it's a gambler car, and so I don't care. I'm just going to run what I got. But I can see here, there's just some chatter here, and I think most of that was actually due to the bell housing just not being bolted up. So there were like 2 or 3 bolts that were actually holding it in, and half of them were either finger tight or like one of them was all the way backed out. So this thing was barely holding on. So I imagine there's quite a bit of flex between where the transmission, the bell housing, meets the back of the motor. And so that obviously chewed up this clutch. Hopefully getting all the bolts in there and a fresh clutch will make that go away. So the transmission is out, and now we're focused on the motor, and I've decided I'm gonna pull this thing out. It's actually not that much work. With the bell housing bolts already undone, with all of that access, there's just a few things like the accessories. I gotta drain the coolant, motor mounts, all that stuff. The big thing I was worried about was these vacuum lines, but even though, gosh, this just is an absolute mess. You can see why people do the Weber carburetor, because this is just a disaster. It seems like the connections are actually pretty easy. So hopefully that's true. I'm looking at things like this. It goes into some kind of vacuum canister, but that just pops off, so that can stay on the engine side. All of these back here have connectors, and so I can take a picture of this and just know, hey, this one's got 4, this one's got 2, and then this one right here, you can barely see it in the camera, but that's got a blue stripe on it, and that's got a blue stripe, green stripe, that one's got a green stripe. And so all these connections seem pretty idiot-proof. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna connect everything from the body and leave everything on the motor side, specifically attached to the carburetor. I actually don't think it has any vacuum leaks right now, but obviously I can test that when I'm done. Other things like the distributor and the coil, I'll figure out the easiest way to take those off. But I think it'll give me a lot more room to work, especially when I'm looking at mounting the master cylinder right here for the hydraulic slave cylinder. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this thing pulled out. Honestly, it'll make me so much happier to just clean this thing. I'll be able to get up underneath there, figure out where the oil is coming from, seal everything up, might even be able to get a better pulse on the health of this motor. It kind of sounds terrible, but either way, I'll be able to get it cleaned up, be able to start with a fresh engine bay. It'll just make working on this car right now and in the future so much nicer. So I'm gonna get to pulling this thing out. Shouldn't be too bad. Hopefully I can figure out how to label all those vacuum lines, and we'll get this thing out of here. So even though this motor is probably not going to last very long, it was really good to get it pulled out. It only took me about a half hour, and disconnecting everything was way easier than I thought it was going to be. A few bolts later, and I was able to hoist it out of the body. So the motor's out and it's clean. I've been hard at work pulling out all sorts of parts. I've got this thing fully disconnected, and honestly, this was not that hard to take off. Like I said in the video before this, you just disconnect all of those things that were pretty obvious from the body, and it seems like they can only go on one way, and I took video and pictures of it, and it seems like these vacuum lines are all gonna go on pretty easy. So this only took me 30 minutes to pull out, and it is so nice to have it out and clean and power washed, and it gives me a better idea of where the leaks are. And so I was able to clean all of that up, and I think most of the leak is coming from here and the valve cover gasket. There's a few other gaskets in here that I'm suspicious of, but I actually have a lot of these gaskets from when I picked up the 3 Monteros. There were a bunch of parts that came with it. So I'm gonna jump in here and replace all the gaskets I can. Definitely the valve cover, the intake, and I'm gonna seal that up with RTV. I'm also gonna flip it over and redo the oil pan and just give it the best shot of not leaking. So I'm super pleased to have that the way it is. I'm gonna throw in spark plugs and do a few other things just to freshen this up, like spark plug leads, just because I have the parts and they're laying around. Then this is the new transmission, as I mentioned before. It's going to have a little different bell housing and therefore a little different throwout bearing and clutch actuation. It's going to be hydraulic versus manual. And so I'm working on figuring that out. It's going to involve drilling into the firewall and mounting an actual reservoir for the slave cylinder, a master cylinder. But that's going to be a little later on. But this thing's all clean and it's ready to drop in. It's the exact same thing as the one that came out of it. As far as dimensions go, splines go, all of that is the same. Another thing that I've moved on to is axles. So this might be getting a little out of hand, but I've already pulled some axles out, and this is where the mix and match gets fun. So I mentioned before, this comes out of a Raider and it'll bolt right into this Ram 50 or this Mighty Max. It's the same exact transmission for the 4-cylinder. But this is also fun for me. So Monteros and apparently Raiders and Mighty Maxes and all that stuff have very similar drivetrains, and therefore the differentials are very similar. So let me see if I can walk through this. This guy right here is the axle housing out of a 1991 Mitsubishi Mighty Max. It's a 10-bolt housing with a third member, and this is a 9-inch ring gear. So this is the one that came out of it, and these are 423 gears. It's written on the back side of this. You can see right here it says 422.2. That's rounded up to 423 most of the time. Either way, 4.2 gears. That's what's coming in this 1991 Mighty Max. So the axle is actually a little bit wider than the Monteros and the Raiders, but it uses generally the same construction. The leaf springs are very similar. The axle dimensions are similar. Like I said, it's a little bit wider. However, the third members are the same. So this is the third member that came out, the 4.2s. And then this is the third member that I pulled out of the blue Raider that I scrapped earlier. That one was an 89. And that's the one that I said had the really beefy rear end for the Montero platform. So that's where this came from, and these are 4.63 gears. So this is a much better gear ratio for running big tires, even above this. But the original one that comes in the Mighty Max, the original housing, which is a little bit smaller than this, I'll get to that when I pull both of them out. The one that comes in the Mighty Max is 3.9. So I'm going from 3.9 to 4.6. And so this, theoretically, this whole housing will bolt into both into the leaf springs, and the tail shaft will bolt into the drive shaft right here. Theoretically, this will all bolt into the Dodge Ram that I have out there, the Ram 50 that I'm calling the Mighty Max. I know, guys, it's getting confusing. But either way, this is a fun thing that I want to show you. This is stuff that some people know, but not many. And so I wanted to put on the internet of, if you can count all of this stuff up, if you can figure out exactly what you have, it should be that any Montero, any Mitsubishi product with a 10-bolt third member has interchangeable third members. So this is a 10-bolt and this is a 10-bolt. Even though they came out of totally different vehicles, this will bolt straight into there. I've actually already tried it. I pulled it out so I could clean up all the surfaces, and I'm gonna go ahead and slap that in there, get this thing buttoned up. And that moves me on to this. This is the front diff, and you can see right there, 4.625. This is the front diff that came out of that same Raider, that 89 Raider that had the V6, the manual transmission, and it had that 10-bolt rear. And so this should theoretically bolt in as well. However, I've heard it requires a little more modification. I think that these diff mounts are different. I'm going to check when I pull the front diff on the Ram that I have outside. And I've heard you might have to swap the CV axles. So I grabbed those, I've got this diff, and now I'm going to get to putting this thing together, getting this all siliconed up, buttoned up, getting the motor sealed up, and then I'm going to pull the front diff and I'm going to swap that in. And then we'll finally be on to putting all of this stuff that's in my garage back into the truck. So this is one of my favorite things about the Montero platform is they came in a lot of different gear options that all fit the same housings. And so this is something I've talked about with the Gen 3, I've even done this with the Gen 2, and it's even true on the Gen 1, even across different platforms like this Mighty Max axle coming from a Raider. And so it's really cool to mix and match and allows you to run a lot better gear ratios. After I got it installed, I went ahead and I pulled the other rear end out from the Ram 50 and got that put away, and I was ready to install the new axle. I'm thinking we line up the front first. Yep, keep going forward. Oh, we need to go over your way just a little. Sure enough, the Mighty Max axle rolled right underneath and bolted up right in all of the factory spots. So I've got the rear end out of the Dodge Ram 50, and this whole time I've been talking about how it's a 10-bolt rear, and so you can tell the difference. Well, it turns out this is also a 10-bolt rear, so that's kind of deceiving. I'll go over some of the differences that I can see, but I'll tell you what, this does not appear like it can fit in this. This is the one out of the Mighty Max, which is the same bolt pattern, is the same size, different gear ratio, as the one that came out of the Raider that's now underneath the truck. And this one is bigger and beefier, and so as I'm measuring these bolt holes where they would line up, it turns out this would not bolt into this housing. And so this housing is smaller. I'm going to guess that this diff is smaller. Maybe it's an 8-inch, maybe it's an 8.5, but it's not the 9-inch that this one is. So one of the big differences I'm noticing is that these guys have a rounded bottom right here. So the bottom of the diff is rounded. Versus this one, you can see now, has a flat bottom. And you can see it just has a little more, I don't know if I'd call it gusseting, but it's got some more support. It kind of flares out a little more further down the axle tube so that it's a little more supported. Someday, if I decide to run 35s on this, I might pull this out and truss it, where you actually add quite a bit more metal to support that. But as it is right now, that's going to be plenty good for me. So you can see they are different. That one's going to be bigger, it's better, and it just bolted up exactly the same way that it came out. So that's really cool. All the shocks work the same. Everything is the same. The dimensions are the same. I think the brakes are the same. Just that center section, and therefore the third member is bigger. So super stoked that that's in. I'm stoked that this is out. This is gonna go under that truck so I can roll it to scrap. And now we'll move on to the front diff. So now that the rear axle is swapped in, it's time to move on to the front. And I've heard that the front is a little different. This is the same gear ratio and the same differential that came out of that same Montero that supplied the one for the rear. So I believe it was a 1989 Dodge Raider, the V6, the coil sprung. And this is gonna be a little bit bigger, and you can see right there, 4.625. So it's the right gear ratio, and theoretically this will bolt in. However, I've heard mixed results. Either it's gonna bolt in, no problem, or you're gonna have to change some things around. In looking at this, it looks pretty much the same. It's possible that these mounts are a little bit different. I might have to swap those over. I've heard something about swapping the CV axles over. I'm not 100% sure, so the only thing I know how to do is to take it apart and see. So I'm gonna get in there, I'm gonna tear this thing apart, pull the CV axles out both sides, and drop that diff down. Pulling these front CV axles can be kind of a pain. You have to remove the entire knuckle in order to get the CV axle out. So that's upper ball joint, lower ball joint, tie rods. You have to take the auto hub off and the brake caliper. But once you do all of that, it's pretty easy to pull it out and get it replaced. So I managed to get both sets of CV axles out, and I figured before I get everything put in the car, I would go ahead and see how they fit into this diff, because like I said, I've heard you have to swap the CV axles, but I wasn't sure. I've got them lined up right here next to the Raider axles. which came with this diff out of the Raider. And so as you can see right here, these ones, they're the same dimensionally this way. So tip to tip, it's the same. I actually mic'd this as well. These two are the same, and these two are the same. This goes into the hub. However, the input shaft seal, or input shaft into the diff, is a little different. This one, which is coming out of the Dodge Ram, is actually a little bit smaller, maybe by 1 or 2 millimeters, versus this one's bigger. So this one just kind of rotates around in there and doesn't actually engage, versus this one will. And then on the passenger side of things, we have a little bit of a difference here. This pattern and this pattern are the same. You can see basic configuration, it's the same. However, this bolt hole to this bolt hole and all the other ones, that dimension is smaller than it is coming from the Raider or Montero. And so this is just a little bit wider. You could theoretically hog those holes out so that they would work with this bolt pattern, but putting this in is way easier. And I actually mic'd this as well, and they're the same. And then this is a little bit different. This one appears to be about 90 in diameter, 90 millimeters in diameter, versus this one's about 85. Will it make an enormous difference? Probably not, but having stronger components is always a good thing, and more importantly, they fit. So now it's time to drop that diff out, put that diff in, reassemble these CV axles, and put this thing back on the ground. Jeez, so gross. Getting this front diff installed by myself at 2 a.m. was a feat. This thing weighs a ton, it's in a really awkward spot. There's not a lot of room to maneuver it inside the chassis of the vehicle. And so to say it was annoying is an understatement. But after a lot of struggle, I was able to get it up there with the assistance of my floor jack. To my surprise, everything bolted up exactly the same. All of the bolt holes were exactly the same. It fit the exact same way. So the only thing that's really different between these two differentials is the size of the input shaft from the CV that goes into the diff carrier. While I had both sides and knuckles torn apart, I decided to go in and take off the factory bump stops and cut them down so that I could have a little more lift in the front end when I cranked up the torsion bars. This was a very smoky process, and it made my garage look like I was up to something super sketchy in the middle of the night. So I've got the diff swapped in, I've got the CV axles and the knuckles reattached, torsion bars cranked back up. I did have to lower those to get the A-arms to slide in. I also cut the bump stops while I was in there. I got the whole thing figured out. It's all installed, so we're back to getting the transmission and the motor back in. This diff actually just bolted straight in as far as the dimensions go, like the mounts and all that, that's the same. That drive shaft I'm thinking is gonna be the same. I did check it earlier, so everything's good here. It bolts up. It's just those CV axles, like I said, they're a little bit bigger. And now this brings us to the last bit that's challenging. I need to figure out how to put a hydraulic slave cylinder right here. I need to put a master cylinder, right here, so I can use a hydraulic slave cylinder, because the transmission I'm putting in came out of a Raider, and those have hydraulic cylinders. Let me show you what I mean. So right here we have a slave cylinder. This is actuated when you press the clutch pedal. It pushes this rod out like I showed you before. The Mighty Max one, or not the Mighty Max one, the Dodge Ram one right here, the Ram 50, this one came originally, the transmission that was in here came with a mechanical one. I want to switch over to this because this transmission is in way better shape. It's got less miles on it. And it's got second gear. The other one didn't have second gear. So that requires me to make some changes. This is gonna pay off in the long run, because pretty much no matter what I do for a transmission in the future for this truck, it's gonna use a hydraulic one, not a mechanical one. So this is a mod that kind of, it is future-proofing the build. So I've got to figure out how to get this in here, but the big difference is mounting that master cylinder. So this is the master cylinder that I pulled out of the Mighty Max that I've been using as a parts car, because that one comes with a hydraulic slave cylinder and master cylinder. And then this is the clutch pedal that's in there as well. Let me show you what it looks like inside of the Ram presently. So we've got the carpet pulled back here, but you can see inside the Ram right now, this is just loose because it's not attached to anything, but this is the current pedal, and it's attached to some kind of mechanism up here that actuates that right there, which is then attached to the cable which actuates the clutch. So I need to delete this, which shouldn't be too hard to just pull this out of here, and I need to put a different pedal right there. So that's where it is on the Mighty Max that I have outside. It goes right in that spot. So I need to figure out how to get rid of this one and add a different one so that I can have that master cylinder for the hydraulic slave cylinder. So if all that jargon was too confusing, basically I need to drill a hole here so I can put the different pedal in so that I can have the clutch that's going to work with the transmission that I'm putting in. So I made up a template. I'm going to go ahead and put it on here, see if I can't drill some holes in my car and actually make this thing work. All right, after some struggle, the master cylinder is in. So this is really exciting. I did end up drilling those holes and I used the template and I had to oversize it just a little bit to get it right. But it's pretty much straight up and down. It's in the factory location like it was on the Mighty Max, and it's looking good. It's pretty secure in there. I'll explain a little more about the bracing on the inside. And I've went ahead and I've routed this down here. Now it's a little bit different. You can see that's where it pops out, and then on the end of that is the slave cylinder. The Mighty Max body, and therefore the Raider bodies, they have a mount for a tab for that hard line to turn into that soft line. That doesn't exist here, so I might make one later. But in the meantime, I've got to get this thing done in just a couple days. So I'm just going to leave that there. I might zip tie it out of the way. That's all good. So now I've got the master cylinder, the slave cylinder. And on the inside, you can see the clutch pedal lines up just like it did with the other pedal. So it's actually in the same placement, even though the other one was straight up and down. This one comes from way over here because it's attached to the firewall over here for the master cylinder. And it doesn't have anything attached to it right now. So you can see it'll kind of slam like that. And it's supposed to have a little bit of bracing up here. So you can see actually above that bracket, there's two bolt holes and you can see it wiggling there. There's supposed to be a piece of metal that is tack welded in right there. And so it does have a little bit of movement. I predict that will be an issue in the future. However, for right now, that firewall is holding it well enough as long as I'm not getting crazy with the clutch. So all I gotta do is attach that pin right there, get the system bled, and of course install the transmission, and we have a hydraulic clutch, which is pretty sweet. So with the hydraulic clutch figured out, this should be ready to go. The slave cylinder will mount up right here. I've got this arm in, I've got the new throwout bearing in. Now I just have to pull the motor off the stand and get the clutch attached. But before I do that, I'm gonna go ahead and put this in the car. I'm gonna attach it with the cross member, get this thing hoisted up. I have a feeling it's gonna be easier to align the motor than it is the transmission. I don't know why I feel like that, but maybe it's just because I've done a lot of engines. So I'm going to put the transmission in first, have that hanging in the car, and then I'm going to attach the motor to that. So let's get this thing jacked up, let's get it situated on the cross member, and get this thing installed in this Ram. Transmission is in. Look how good it looks sitting there, all clean, new throwout bearing. The hydraulic slave cylinder is attached. This thing actually wasn't too bad. Obviously, it's a lot of work to wrestle around a transmission and a transfer case, but I had a floor jack that really helped. I was able to get it up there with the cross member. It's situated, all the bushings are attached, all the wiring was exactly the same, just as I expected. So that thing's good, that thing's in there. So now it's time to push this back, get the engine up in the air, put the clutch on, and then drop this thing into place. Looking back, it totally would have been worth it to machine this flywheel. It ended up having some chatter after all. After I got the clutch attached though, I did go ahead and drop in the motor, and it was super simple. This thing bolts right up. These motors are very easy to reinstall. Even the vacuum lines weren't that much of a pain. They plugged in exactly like I thought they would. It was pretty easy to figure it out. All right, motor's in, everything's buttoned up, everything's attached, it's got oil in it, and I've made my way through most of the checklist. So now it's time to see if this thing actually is going to fire up. It should. It's the motor that came out of here. I'm hoping that I hooked everything up correctly. Hopefully it's happy. I changed the plugs, I changed the wires, I moved a bunch of stuff around. So we're gonna crank it, make sure this thing fires up, and then it's time to figure out the transmission. I've got the front drive shaft in right now because I was putting that in last night. I haven't hooked up the rear drive shaft yet, but before we get too much further, I just wanna fire it up and see if it'll run. Okay, I might have finally run into my first thing that I can't fix with this build. So right here, I have two drive shafts, one out of the Mighty Max and one out of the Ram 50. And there's a couple differences between them. They are relatively the same shape, like most drive shafts are. With the U-joint, as far as that, it's not broken up into two pieces or got some kind of funky thing here. If you line these up and you go down, you can see that these are just a little bit off. We're talking maybe a ½ an inch from the mounting surface. However, the big difference is this one right here is set up to bolt to our new diff. And that flange is just a little bit wider than it is here. So these bolt holes right there, even though they're the same configuration, they're a little bit wider than they are on the Ram 50. So I tried to bolt this up to the diff and it did not work. However, this one will. The problem is that this side of the input shaft, or I guess this would go on the output shaft of the transmission, this on the Mighty Max is bigger because it came with the bigger transmission and the V6, and this one is smaller for the smaller transmission. And so basically what I need to do is I need to take this drive shaft, and this is the correct length, by the way, because this came out of the Ram 50. I need to take this front section, this middle section, and the length, but I need to adapt it to fit this. Now I thought about swapping the U-joints, but even that's different. So I have to go to a driveline shop. Theoretically, this should be pretty easy. They can just cut it and move it over. I don't need this driveline anymore. I'm not doing anything with that truck. So they can just take this cap and they can weld it to this. These are almost exactly the same dimension. And so depending on where they cut it and how they weld it, it shouldn't be a problem. They can get it balanced out. And then I should have a custom drive shaft adapting the back of the 4-cylinder transmission to the bigger diffs. And fingers crossed, that'll be the last of it. So I need to get this off to a drive shaft shop. Hopefully they can turn it around pretty quickly for me and I'll be able to get this thing thrown in the car. All right, the custom drive shaft is done. So I brought this to a driveline shop. They took the measurements from the Mighty Max drive shaft, and then they got the ends from both the transmission slip yoke and the differential flange, and they made this one. So it should be the exact same length as the one that came out of the Ram 50. However, it's got the transmission mount, the skinnier one, and it's got the bigger end for attaching to the diff that came out of the Raider. So now that I've got that in, let's throw this in and see if this thing can drive. All right, this thing is back on the road. I got the diffs installed, I got the drive shafts installed, new transmission, got the clutch in, got the motor in. I've got a bunch of stuff checked off this list. As you can see, the last real thing I have to do is put 33-inch tires on. So I already have the tires, they're already on wheels, and now I'm gonna get them mocked up. This will be interesting. I am almost 100% sure that I can fit them in the rear here. If I just bend this back a little bit, you can see this is all torn up, but I'm just gonna fold that in, maybe hammer some stuff over here, but it should fit in the rear. In the front is a totally different story though. I think I'm gonna remove this part of the bumper. It does unbolt from here, so I'm gonna take that out. I might have to cut a little bit of this, and I think I'm gonna have to massage this as well. I'm gonna try to get by without doing the body lift, but we'll see. So I'm gonna go ahead and start in the rear, get that situated, get a hammer out, move some sheet metal around. The nice thing about this, I do not care about the body. So if I have to cut it, if I have to move it around to make them fit, it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna make them fit. So I'm gonna get to swapping those over and we'll see how they fit on without any modifications. Yes, just as predicted, this totally fits. So I rounded this guy back out and there's worlds of room in here. There's tons of room. I bet this will totally articulate, no problem. And it's quite a bit wider. You see it sticks out. I kind of love that. It's hard to get the perspective right now, especially with the small wheels on the front, but this is great. So the back bolts up just fine, no problems. Now it's time to move over to the front, and I'm definitely gonna have some more issues here, like I mentioned before, but let's get it jacked up. I think I'm gonna go ahead and remove this part of the bumper before I even get started. I just know it's gonna hit. And so I might remove that and then get to fitting the front and see how it feels. All right, front of the bumper is removed, so there's lots of room and clearance up there, but I'm running into the back here of the fender, and I knew I would. So I'm gonna go ahead and just cut this section out. There's 2 bolts that hold the bottom of the fender on, so I'm trying to keep that one, and I'm gonna try to remove about 4 inches, 3 or 4 inches right here, and cut all the way up here. And then I'm gonna have to deal with the inner fender as well as the firewall. I'm probably gonna have to just smash that with a hammer, but I'm gonna cut this first and move that metal around, and also get rid of this antenna. I'm assuming this is the antenna, and see if I can't get a little more clearance there. Okay, you're hitting right there. It's not too bad. Oh yeah, you can barely tell. We can go a little further, I think.
You want to try it? Maybe a couple more swings for good measure, you know?
Good measure, yep.
Call Brian for any mechanical work you may need on your car. Oh yeah. Oh.
Lots more room.
Oh, beautiful.
After a good bit of smashing out the front with a sledgehammer and cutting some more, I did get the 33s to fit. They look great. The stance is super wide, really aggressive, and they barely rub. All right, it's running and driving, and the 33s are on. It rubs just a little at a full turn, not a big deal. All the clearancing, it made them fit. It's good enough for now. So I'm super pleased. It's running, driving, transmission, clutch, all that stuff is in. This thing is ready for the Gambler. Once the truck was done, I did take it out to the Gambler. Unfortunately, I didn't film that much. I did take a couple pictures, but the thing performed flawlessly. It was so good at hauling trash out of the woods. It was really fun to bomb it around, and it actually performed pretty well off-road. The gears really helped, the tires are really good, even the suspension held up really well. This thing was just a blast. So with the Gambler wrapped up, this truck was officially done with stage 1. So I ended up doing even more work to this thing. What ended up happening is I found another truck. Yes, another Mitsubishi Mighty Max. It had a good door, it had a good bed, and it had this sweet topper on it. And so I'm not really a topper guy, but here in Montana in the winters, it's nice to have some enclosed storage, and it makes it really easy for hauling a bunch of parts. Like you can see in the back here, I've got spare wheels, I've got some cardboard I'm hauling to recycling, and so it's just really practical. So I ended up swapping all of that stuff over. I also threw on this sweet emergency light that Auxbeam hooked me up with. This thing is so much fun to have for the Gambler. Like, it just flashes all over the place. It just adds to the comedic factor, but actually it has quite a bit of practicality to it. If I'm going through a snowstorm, or if I'm doing something where I'm hauling a truck that's kind of broken down across town, I can flip this on and let other people know around me, hey, something's going down. So I'm super thankful that Auxbeam sent this out. It's been a great piece for my Gambler rigs in the past, and it's just gonna bounce around, and it's gonna be on a couple different cars. I attached it using these magnets, so it's really easy to pull it off of this truck and put it on a different truck if I need it for something else. I'm planning on putting a lot more Auxbeam products on this car because they make so many great lighting options, and that'll happen in a future build. So there you have it, guys. This is stage 1 of the Mighty Max build. This thing has been so much fun for me. It's a little atypical, and I know for a lot of you guys, you're like, man, this truck could have been so nice, or you should have restored it, but that is not the purpose of this. I've got other trucks that I'm treating really nicely, that I'm building out, that I'm putting the effort into. I just wanted a beater, something I really don't care about, something that I could run big tires, smash the fenders, it doesn't matter. And so I am thrilled with the way this has turned out. Stage 1 is gonna last me for a couple months. The whole plan is to keep using it as a hauler for all my car parts. I'm starting a business, and so having a little truck is super helpful for me. Just something I can beat around in the winter, and then hopefully I'll get a bigger shop, and in the spring, I'm planning on putting an LS V8 in this. I'm gonna solid axle swap it, NV 3500 transmission, NP 208 transfer case, and I'm gonna run 35s on this thing and make it into a rock crawler. So if you're interested in that, if you wanna stick around for that build, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks so much for joining me in this as I go through this. I know this is a long video, a lot got done to this. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, hopefully inspired you to work on your own car, and I'll see you guys on the next one.